It was just another evening at the Sapphire Club, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. Located in the heart of downtown, the club catered to the rich and powerful, a place where billionaires, celebrities, and socialites gathered to indulge in gourmet meals, expensive wines, and lavish entertainment. The polished, marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, and the air was thick with the aroma of fine cuisine. The staff was impeccably trained, dressed in crisp uniforms, and tasked with delivering an experience fit for royalty. Among the waitstaff was 25-year-old Naomi Carter, a hardworking young woman who had spent the last several years trying to make ends meet. Naomi wasn't living the luxurious life of the club's patrons, but she had a quiet ambition. Despite the long hours and the grueling work, she always held her head high. She had big dreams, dreams that extended far beyond the confines of the restaurant floor. Naomi had a passion for singing and had always hoped that one day, her voice would take her beyond the world of waiting tables. But for now, it was her job at the Sapphire Club that paid the bills. Naomi had learned to keep a low profile around the wealthy patrons who frequented the club. Many of them treated the staff like invisible people, mere servants to serve their whims and desires. Naomi had experienced the sting of being looked down upon, of having her value reduced to nothing more than a uniform and a tray of food. But she was resilient. She knew how to smile and keep a respectful distance, always doing her job with grace, no matter how she was treated. On this particular night, Naomi was serving a table in the far corner of the room. The guests were regulars at the Sapphire Club, known for their ostentatious wealth and their penchant for making rude, inappropriate comments to the staff. Tonight, they had invited a special guest, a millionaire businessman named Charles Davenport, a self-made tycoon who was known for his abrasive personality and controversial views. He was a man who had built his fortune in the tech industry but had no problem flaunting his wealth and making others feel small. Charles Davenport was seated at a large round table with a few of his friends, enjoying the evening and loudly discussing the latest business ventures he was involved in. He was the type of man who felt entitled to everything and anything: money, respect, and, unfortunately, the ability to humiliate people at will. He often picked on the waitstaff, especially when he was in a bad mood. And tonight, Naomi would unfortunately become his next target. Naomi approached the table, her steps measured, her face a mask of professionalism. As she leaned down to ask if the guests were satisfied with their meal, Charles looked up at her with a smirk that she had grown all too familiar with. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You know what would really make this evening memorable? If you sang for us. I'm sure you've got some talent hidden away, right?" Naomi's heart sank as she looked into Charles's eyes, his smirk widening. She had heard him make similar comments before, mostly to other staff members, and she knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't asking because he wanted to hear her sing. He was asking to humiliate her, to put her in a position where she had no choice but to feel small. He wanted to remind her of her place, just a waitress, just someone who existed to serve him and his friends. Her stomach twisted, but Naomi had learned long ago to hide her discomfort behind a professional smile. "I'm afraid I'm not allowed to sing while I'm working, sir," she said, her voice polite, but firm. She had rehearsed this line countless times over the years, using it to shield herself from awkward situations and inappropriate requests. Charles chuckled, his friends joining in with knowing glances. "Oh, come on, it's just for fun. I'm sure you can do better than that," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You must have some skills, right? It would really add to the ambience of the evening. Go on, give us a little show." The table of men laughed, the sound grating in Naomi's ears. She felt the heat rise to her face. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the sneers, the assumption that she had nothing to offer beyond her job. They were used to seeing people like her, young, black, working class, and they were determined to remind her of that. Naomi stood frozen for a moment, torn between wanting to stand her ground and the pressure of the situation. She knew she could refuse again, but something in Charles's voice, something in the way he belittled her, made her feel as though she had no choice. He was testing her, and she couldn't afford to lose her job over something as trivial as his attempt to humiliate her. Before she could respond, one of Charles's friends, a man named Greg, chimed in. "Hey, we're not going anywhere. Just sing something for us. No harm in it, right?" Naomi's chest tightened, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "I really can't, sir," she said, feeling the familiar frustration creeping in. "If you'd like, I can bring you dessert or more drinks. Anything else, just let me know." Charles looked at her for a long moment, and for a brief second, Naomi thought he might let it go. But then his expression shifted again, a smug grin spreading across his face. "No, I think you can do better than that. You're just being difficult. Why don't you sing something? Maybe then you'll get a tip worth your time." The words stung more than she could explain. Naomi had always worked hard for every penny she earned, but she had never expected to be reduced to something so cheap, something so demeaning. She took a slow breath, closing her eyes for a brief moment to gather her thoughts. If she could just get through this, if she could just make him understand that she wasn't some sort of circus performer, maybe she could leave the table and never have to deal with it again. But as she stood there, trying to find the words to defuse the situation, a voice inside her spoke up. It wasn't a voice of anger, but a quiet, confident voice that urged her to stand tall, to rise above the judgment. For a moment, Naomi hesitated, her mind racing with thoughts of how to handle this. She had always wanted to sing in public, to let her voice be heard. But never like this. Never in a way that felt like she was being forced to perform, to entertain people who didn't see her for who she was, but only for what they thought she could do for them. And then, in that brief moment of hesitation, she made a decision. "If you really want to hear something," Naomi said quietly, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice, "I'll sing." The table went silent. Charles's grin faltered slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. He hadn't expected this. Naomi wasn't the person he thought she was, someone who would cower, someone who would be humiliated by his words. She wasn't about to play the part he had scripted for her. Naomi took a deep breath and turned away from the table. She walked to the side of the restaurant, to a small area where the piano sat. Her fingers lightly brushed the keys as she sat down, her heart beating a little faster now. She had made her choice. If they wanted a show, she would give them something they wouldn't forget. The piano began to play under her fingers, and Naomi's voice, rich and soulful, filled the room. She didn't sing just to perform. She sang because music was the only thing that had ever made her feel truly alive. It was the one thing in her life that had always belonged to her, the one thing she had to offer that no one could take away. At first, there was silence at the table, And then, as her voice rang out through the room, Naomi felt a sense of liberation. She was no longer just the waitress. She was someone whose talent could not be dismissed. She poured her heart into the song, letting the music flow through her. Her voice was strong, commanding, and effortless. As she sang, the room seemed to pause, as if everyone present was hearing something they hadn't expected to hear. Charles and his friends sat in stunned silence, their mouths agape as they listened. What had started as an attempt to belittle her had quickly turned into something unexpected. They had wanted to mock her, but instead, they were captivated by her raw talent. They had thought her nothing more than a young black woman working a low-paying job, but now they were seeing a side of her they had never anticipated. When Naomi finished the song, there was a moment of silence before a hesitant round of applause filled the room. It wasn't loud or forceful, but it was there, and it meant something. Naomi stood up slowly, her heart still pounding from the intensity of the moment. She had sung for herself, not for them, but their reaction was a reminder that sometimes people are surprised when you show them your true power. She turned back to the table, where Charles and his friends were now looking at her with something that resembled respect. But Naomi didn't need their approval. She had already won. The silence in the restaurant hung thick after Naomi's final note drifted away, the last reverberations of her voice still echoing in the air. The clinking of silverware, the murmur of patrons, and the bustle of the kitchen seemed distant as the moment stretched into eternity. Naomi stood still, her heart pounding in her chest, every muscle tense as she waited for the reaction from the table. Her hands rested lightly on the piano keys, not just as a guide but as a silent anchor, keeping her grounded in the moment. For a few seconds, there was nothing but stunned silence. The table of men, including Charles, looked at her as if they had just seen something they didn't understand, something they weren't prepared for. Charles, who had smirked at her only moments before, now sat frozen, his mouth agape, his usual bravado completely absent. His friends, too, were staring, blinking, unsure of how to react to what had just unfolded. Naomi's chest rose and fell with each steady breath. She didn't need applause. She didn't need their validation. She had sung not to entertain them, but because it was her right to share her talent with the world, regardless of the space she found herself in. Music was hers. It belonged to no one else. It was Charles who broke the silence first, but his voice, which had been so mocking just moments before, was now filled with something else. Something Naomi hadn't expected. "Wait a minute," Charles said, his voice almost a whisper, as if he was unsure of what he had just witnessed. "That was incredible. You have an amazing voice." Naomi raised an eyebrow, her fingers still lingering on the piano, but her attention shifting toward him. "What's the matter?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "Don't like being proven wrong?" Charles blinked a couple of times, the realization slowly sinking in that he hadn't been dealing with an ordinary waitress. This wasn't someone whose talents were just meant to serve him. This was a woman whose skills could stand on their own, in a space he hadn't expected. "Look," Charles said, clearly trying to recover from the shock. "I didn't mean for you to actually perform. I thought you'd just sing a little something for fun. But, wow, I didn't expect that. You should be on stage, not serving tables." His voice was quieter now, a little more reflective, but it still carried that underlying sense of condescension he couldn't completely shake. Naomi straightened, feeling the weight of his words. But it didn't hit the same way it would have before. This was no longer a moment of humiliation. It was something different, something she was in control of. "I'm not here for your entertainment," she said slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly. "But thank you for the compliment." Her tone wasn't dismissive, but it wasn't apologetic either. She had sung because she wanted to, not to validate his judgment of her. Naomi had known from the moment she stepped into this career that she wasn't just a waitress. She was more than her uniform, more than the assumptions people made about her. Charles cleared his throat and shifted in his seat, now realizing that this wasn't just a young woman he could manipulate. There was a certain presence about her that demanded respect, something beyond her race or her job title. And now he felt a twinge of embarrassment. The idea that he had mocked her so openly, only to be floored by her raw talent, didn't sit well with him. It was a moment of reckoning. "You know," he began, clearing his throat again, "I think you've got something. I mean, really, you shouldn't be here. You could be performing, making a living from that voice. I have connections in the music industry and—" Naomi cut him off, her gaze unwavering. "I didn't sing for your approval, Mr. Davenport. You wanted a show and I gave it to you. But you don't get to determine what I do with my life." There was no anger in her voice, just a calm certainty. She was no longer the girl who worked at a restaurant to make ends meet. She was a woman who had a future, a dream, and a voice that no one could diminish, no matter their wealth or their influence. Charles hesitated, a slight edge of discomfort creeping onto his face as Naomi spoke. The atmosphere at the table had shifted. His friends, who had once been smug and judgmental, now looked at him in silence. One of them cleared his throat, breaking the stillness. "That was amazing," the man said, the tone of his voice now genuine. "I didn't know you had that in you." Naomi raised her eyes briefly, meeting his gaze for a split second. There was a shift in the air, a recognition that she wasn't what they thought she was. The quiet judgment that had clouded their initial interactions was now giving way to something more akin to respect. "I'm not a circus act," Naomi replied, her voice gentle but strong. "I'm not here to entertain you. I'm here because I need to make a living. And singing, my singing, is something personal. It's a part of me." Charles sat back, now fully aware of the effect his initial request had. He had intended to belittle her, to assert his dominance with a simple request for a performance. But the way she carried herself, the way she turned his expectations upside down, left him rethinking his actions. He had a lot of power, a lot of money, but in that moment he realized that there were things that money couldn't buy, and talent was one of them. "I didn't mean to disrespect you," Charles said after a pause, his tone less condescending than before. "I just thought, sometimes people who are in your position just want to get through the day, right? But you're different. You're special." Naomi nodded, her gaze softening just a fraction. "I don't need your pity, Mr. Davenport, but I do appreciate you acknowledging that I'm not just a waitress. I'm not just here to serve people like you." There was a moment of silence as Charles processed her words. He glanced around the table, noticing that his friends were no longer laughing. They weren't mocking her either. Instead, they were quiet, each of them taking in the reality of the situation. Naomi had shown them something they weren't expecting. "I'm sorry," Charles said finally, the apology not entirely sincere but a step in the right direction. "I was out of line." Naomi gave a small nod, her face softening slightly. "It's fine," she said, her voice steady but not dismissive. "But just remember that next time, you don't get to decide what people like me are capable of." The table remained silent for a moment before Charles spoke again, his tone more respectful. "I'd like to offer you something," he said. "A chance to work with some people I know in the music industry. Maybe we can set up a meeting. See if there's something we can do with your voice." Naomi didn't know whether to accept his offer or not. The idea of having a door open to her, an opportunity she had dreamed of for so long, was tempting. But she wasn't sure if it was truly about her talent or if Charles was simply trying to redeem himself for what had happened. "I appreciate the offer," she said, her voice measured, "but I'm not sure this is the right way for me to get where I want to go. I'll figure it out on my own." Charles looked at her, his face showing a mixture of surprise and admiration. "You're something else," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "All right, fair enough." As the night drew to a close, Naomi went back to her duties, serving the rest of her tables with the same professionalism she always did. But something had changed. The energy in the restaurant was different. People looked at her differently. And though she didn't expect anything from Charles Davenport or his friends, she couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory. For the first time in a long while, Naomi knew that she wasn't invisible. She wasn't the girl serving at a restaurant for tips. She was a woman with a talent that no one could deny. And in time, the world would see it. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about her,